Thank you for joining our PRA this morning for our webinar on understanding your requirements as a lighting producer. My name is Michelle Hoover, and I am one of the communications advisors at our PRA and will be your moderator for today's webinar. My colleague Pam Castillo, who is our compliance and service delivery manager, will be hosting today's webinar and will introduce herself in just a moment. Behind the scenes, we have Davina, who is our communications coordinator, and she's driving the slides, and Anusha, who is one of our registry support officers, helping to answer your questions today. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a few housekeeping items. So we will be answering your questions throughout the webinar, and since there's a lot of content to cover today, we will do our best to answer every question. Questions about upcoming requirements, such as registering with RPRA, supply reporting, and working with a pro will be made priority. If we run out of time and are unable to get to your question, you can contact our compliance and registry team at registry@rpra.ca. To ask a question, click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, type in your question, and click send. There's also an upvote feature that allows you to bump up someone else's question to the top of our queue. And this can be valuable if you wanted to ask the same question or you are interested in hearing the answer. If you are experiencing technical issues, please let us know by using the chat function, not the Q&A function, but the chat function, and we will do our best to support you. We've also enabled the live transcript feature that transcribes speech to text on your screen. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website along with the presentation slides, so you can go back and reference it for support. Next slide, please. Okay, so our agenda. So since we are speaking to a pretty new audience today, we will be introducing who our PRA is. We will then review at a high level the electrical and electronic equipment regulation. Then we'll review who is a producer and their requirements under the E-regulation. We then will explain what it means to work with a producer responsibility organization and other service providers. We'll summarize the content that we reviewed today and then provide resources that can support you. And on that note, I will hand it over to Pam.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today for our introduction to understanding your requirements as a lighting producer. As Michelle mentioned, I'm Pam Castillo. I'm the Compliance Manager and Service Delivery here at Ripra. So as the agenda noted, we're going to start with the introduction to Ripra. Next slide, please. So Ripra is a regulatory authority, and this may be a little bit different to what some of you might be familiar with in other jurisdictions if you operate in other provinces here in Canada. So Ripra is not part of government. We are a regulatory body that was created by statute. We were created under the Resource Recovery and Circular Economy Act, which is a statute that sets out the framework for individual producer responsibility here in Ontario. Regulations such as the electrical and electronic equipment, the blue box, hazardous and special products, batteries and tires, they are underneath the RRCEA statute. That statute created our PRA, and it gives us our authority and powers, which we're going to talk to a little bit more about so that everyone is familiar with them. You'll see in the first bullet point as well that there's also a reference to the Waste Diversion Transition Act, and it's a previous legislation that sets out how programs, legacy programs such as the MHSW program, or the OES program that wound up late last year, and how they transition into the new RRCEA world. Next slide, please. So the authority's mandate is written up here, and two of the big ones that we're going to be talking about today are with regards to establishing and operating a digital registry. And this is where obligated parties register and report information to RPRA. And this is our main tool for compliance. We also undertake compliance and enforcement of the legislation and regulations. And so what that really means is that we ensure that obligated parties register and report using our digital reporting system. We ensure that obligated material under the regulations continue to be collected throughout the province. We ensure that management requirements are being met for each of the appropriate regulations. We work with businesses to help them understand their regulatory requirements using our C4C, which is Communications for Compliance. And we also ensure that that one of our priorities for producers is just something that we take back, is that we want to ensure that producers and everyone who is obligated, that we're maintaining a level playing field for all of the stakeholders involved. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, that we're not government, our compliance decisions are independent from government. So I'd like to highlight just some differences between RPRA and the ministry. So Ripra, RPRA, or the authority, if I use those words interchangeably, I am referring to RPRA. So we don't write the policy or the regulation. So questions like, why was this material in or out, or why was the regulation written a certain way, or what was the intention behind a specific section in the regulation. Those are questions better suited for the Ministry of Environment and Conservation Park. They determine the policy, they set out that policy, they develop that regulation, and then it gets passed by cabinet. So any questions about, if you would like to see a change in the regulation, anything of that may come up in the future, those are more appropriate conversations to be had with the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. There's certainly things that can come to our PRA as well, because it does help us understand some of the operations as these regulations roll out for each of the different material categories within a specific regulation, or the other regulation as a whole. But our role is really about enforcing and interpreting and making sure that producers have what they need in order to comply. So once the regulation passes, regardless of what the intention or what the intent of the regulation is, regardless of what the policy was supposed to be, our PRA is left with the regulation the way it was written, and it's our job to enforce what's in the regulation. Another point to call out here is that we do not arrange for the actual collection or recycling of obligated materials. We're the compliance and enforcement body to ensure that materials are being collected and recycled. And as an oversight body, it really is up to the producers to figure out how they're going to comply. And as the webinar as we get further along in the webinar, we are going to talk about producer responsibility organizations and how they can arrange for the recycling and collection of a producer's materials once they reach their end of life. Next slide, please. So here is a general overview of the programs that RPRA oversees under the RRCEA. So you heard me say before that the RRCEA is a statute that sets out the framework for individual producer responsibility in Ontario. And I highlighted again the regulations that fall under that, that fall underneath the statute. So we're not going to talk about all the programs that have transitioned to date. We are going to stay focused on the e-regulation as it relates to lighting. But let's just take a quick note in terms of what's happened in the past few years. So we have begun, multiple programs have begun their transition or completed their transition under the new sort of regime. And you can see here that we've transitioned tires. That regulation came into effect in 2018, and it was fully operational effective Jan 1st of 2019. So we've transitioned tires, and batteries in the last 3 years. Effective January 1st of 2021, the first sort of obligated material under the e-regulation began its transition. And there are currently 13 pros that are operating or providing services to producers under the requirements that producers are expected to fulfill. In January of 2023, so in about 5 months from now, lighting transitions. And then you'll see here as well that Blue Box is fully expected to transition between 2023 and 2025. And those are dates that are stipulated under each of the regulations. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of the key players in the producer responsibility framework. So I'm going to discuss this in the next couple of slides, but I sort of wanted to give everyone an overview of how this all comes together and how we work together. So again, you have the Ontario government. They're the ones developing the policy, deciding the legislation, approving any changes to any of the regs that would be required. And then in the middle sort of column, you see that RPRA is enforcing those regulations. And we're doing so through an approach of communications and communications for compliance. And we also have powers to enforce certain things under the regulation. So that's also one of our compliance toolkits. So people understand, again, we're not the ones ultimately deciding what the policy is, but we're here to provide guidance to producers so that they are able to comply with those requirements set out in the regulations. Then you've got the producers on the far right of this diagram, and they are responsible for establishing the collection management systems to meet the requirements, again, set out in each of the regulations. Next slide, please. And then here as a continuation to sort of how this all comes together, you'll see that we have on the left-hand side the producer responsibility organizations. And these are companies who are going to provide services to producers so that they are able to comply and meet those requirements set out in the regs. And they'll do this by working directly as well with other service providers like haulers, refurbishers, and processors of the obligated materials. So in this presentation, we're not going to get into the details about the haulers, refurbishers, and processors. You can see that they are defined here in different bullet points, but they do have requirements to register and report with RPRA as well. And they have the same sort of deadline this year to register with RPRA by the November 30th deadline. So just one thing that I wanted to call out is that we have here where it says the hauler is a person that arranges for the transport of material. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that company who is actually doing the transporting is actually considered a hauler. So if there's any sort of service provider on the line, or if we want to sort of understand what that actually means, I would encourage, and Michelle mentioned this before, and there will be in subsequent slides, there will be information on how to contact us, but we do encourage people to reach out to our compliance and registry team by email and by telephone to sort of have more discussions on what that may actually mean. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes here to talk about how all of those relationships come together and how it all fits again. So in this graphic, you can see that we have commercial players here, which essentially are the service providers, the pros, and the producers. So we've got here RPRA at the top, we've got the producers, we have the pros, and we have the other service providers. So you'll see the long black arrows. that are all leading to RPRA, and then the small little arrow in between producers and RPRA. Those are there to designate the regulatory relationship that exists between RPRA and those three groups. So all three groups have to register and report annually. We won't be getting into specifics on annual performance reporting for these three groups in today's webinar, but more information is available on our website. So again, those long black arrows and the small one in between producers and RPRA, they represent the regulatory relationship. Then you have the smaller black arrows between the pros, the service providers, and producers, and they represent a competitive marketplace sort of relationship. So RPRA is not involved in that. So producers, pros, and other service providers are going to contract with one another with the objective of meeting a producer's requirements. When then it ultimately, all of that gets reported to RPRA. So it's fundamental for producers to understand that they are looking at a competitive marketplace, that they will have a number of options available to them so that they can meet these requirements set out in the regulation, but individual producers are now individually responsible for meeting performance requirements. And again, what that really means is just collecting and recycling material based on what the definition of that material is under the e-regulation. Next slide, please. So I'll pause here for questions.
So if anyone has any questions about the previous section, so about RPRA, about those key players that Pam mentioned, this would be a great time to ask. So we'll just wait a minute to see if any questions come in. So there's a question here about the presentation slide, and yes, to reiterate, this presentation will be made available on our website later today or tomorrow. And then we have another question, but it's more tailored to later in the presentation. So I'll say, let's move forward, Pam.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the Ontario e-regulation. So the government of Ontario released the final electrical and electronic equipment regulation back in September 21st of 2020, which includes two separate materials, ITTAV and lighting equipment, as I mentioned earlier as well, effective January 1st of 2021. ITT and AV producers became individually accountable and financially responsible for collecting and reusing, refurbishing or recycling their products when consumers discard them. And then starting in January of next year, lighting producers will also become individually accountable and financially responsible for collecting and reusing and recycling their products when consumers discard them. Next slide, please. So there are some key requirements that producers must fulfill. And it's highlighted here in the bullet points where they're obligated to register with RPRA. We do have it in subsequent slides that the deadline is November 30th of this year, based on when a lighting producer started marketing lighting products into the province of Ontario, and then we'll get into specifics about what that actually means in terms of supply and obligated producers. But For the sake of the next couple of slides, obligated producers are required to register with RPRA. They're required to report their supply data to us annually. They are required to meet mandatory and enforceable requirements as it relates to collection, to managing, to establishing and operating a collection system. The same thing for managing, establishing and managing the lighting that is collected. They must also meet certain requirements for promotion and education, and that's essentially informing the public of their options on where they can drop off used lighting products. And then once we get into subsequent years when producers have to actually report on their performance, there are certain years where producers or pros on their behalf have to provide third-party audit verification that the actions that were taken in a particular performance period to collect and recycle material was actually met. And so they do this by reporting to RPRA annually and then providing a third-party auditor who's verified that data. And then just, another call out that under this new framework, lighting producers can choose how to meet their collection and management requirements in a competitive marketplace, again, which will be fairly new to some of us on the line, and maybe something that they've heard before, because we have potential producers here who also have obligations under some of the other regulations that we oversee. Next slide, please. So the e-regulation does define the material category of lighting. So I just wanted to sort of start off with the most top level definition of what E is. And that is equipment that's designed for use with an electrical current as voltage of less than 1,000 volts or alternating current at 1,500 volts for direct current. Another sort of top level definition is that the the E equipment cannot weigh more than 250 kilograms, and that the E is not intended to be used permanently as part of a building or structure. E also does not include the packaging or paper that comes with the product itself. That essentially is part of another regulation that we oversee. And so there are two categories of obligated E, which high level just mentioned, I've mentioned before, which is the information technology, telecommunications, and audiovisual, which I've been referring to as ITTAV, and then obviously the lighting, which is the focus of today's webinar. So the e-regulation defines lighting as equipment that has the primary purpose of producing light. And some of the examples set out in section 2 of Schedule 1 of the e-regulation, they're listed here on the slide. So examples include light bulbs, tubes, and lamps. And we also know that the regulation states that lighting does not include lighting that is provided with another product or a fixture. And it also doesn't include lighting that falls into the category of ITT and AV. So it's really important for us to note that this is not intended to represent a complete list of products that are obligated and excluded. We are in the process of developing a more detailed list of obligated lighting products in an upcoming compliance bulletin that we plan to release fairly soon. And that will be a living document. We'll keep it up to date. But again, that document itself is not intended to be a comprehensive list either. We know that for some of the products that fall within the category of lighting, it's a pretty simple process for anybody to determine if it's in or out based on the definition. So if it meets what you're seeing here, if it's a light bulb, a tube and a lamp, and then it meets sort of, the incandescent fluorescent LED or high density discharge sort of criteria, then it's in. But we also know that there are some products that can fall within a gray area. And in this instance, I would really encourage potential obligated producers to contact our compliance and registry team. If they have questions about specific products, where they're unsure if it meets the definition, if it's included, or if it's excluded, please contact our compliance and registry team. As I mentioned before earlier, there will be they will be added. They are posted as a link in subsequent slides, so for your easy reference. So please feel free to reach out to us about any specific questions that you have about a product that you sell and you're unsure whether it meets the definition of an obligated lighting product. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we'll open it up for questions. I see that we have a few questions here that are related to specific, asking for specific materials if they're obligated under the, or captured under lighting. But I would just like to reiterate what Pam just mentioned, that we will be providing a list of materials at a later date. So please stay tuned for that. So I will not be asking those questions out loud. However, you are welcome to email our compliance and registry team, and they will be able to better assist you for that. We also have two other questions that will be covered in the next few sections. So I will hold off on asking them as well, since we haven't reviewed those topics yet. So I'll just give it one more minute to see if there's any other questions that can be read out loud. Okay, I'd say we can move forward because we are getting more specific questions, and our Anusha, who's one of our registry support officers, will be answering them in the chat. So feel free to move forward, Pam.
Great, thank you. So who is a lighting producer? So essentially a person is considered to be a lighting producer if that person supplies lighting to consumers in Ontario. And we first start off with the highest point on the producer hierarchy, and it's the brand holder. If there's a brand holder who's resident in Canada, then that brand holder who markets to consumers in Ontario and sells those products is responsible for reporting what was marketed to consumers in Ontario. Then we go sort of to the next stage. If there is no resident brand holder in Canada, then the resident importer in Ontario who receives that lighting product and markets it to consumers in Ontario to be consumed by Ontario consumers then becomes the obligated producer under the second point. And then if there is no resident importer in Ontario, the person who if there is no resident importer, the company that markets directly to the consumer in Ontario and has residency in Ontario is considered the obligated producer. And then the last point there goes is if there's no resident marketer, the company that markets directly to consumers in Ontario and does not have residency in Ontario becomes the obligated producer. So this sort of last point could be considered somebody who has online sales from outside of the province. And again, it's a hierarchy that starts with the brand holder and it's based on residency until you run out of somebody who doesn't meet that residency criteria and so forth. Next slide, please. So we talked a lot about what a brand holder is. So a brand is any mark, word, name, or any combination of those that includes registered and unregistered trademarks that identifies a product and distinguishes it from other products. So I'm going to be very generic here. As an example, we know there are different types of brands for many different products. So let's say if you have a light bulb and it's branded, let's say as a Philips light bulb. It's a distinguishable brand of light versus, let's say, Sylvania, I think, is another potential brand that may be sold in Ontario. So those are distinguishable brands. They're easily identifiable. They're registered trademarks. That's an example of a brand. The brand holder, again, is the person who owns or licenses the brand and otherwise has the rights to market that product under the brand. You'll see here as well that if there are 2 or more brand holders, then the producer who's most directly connected to the production of the lighting is the brand holder for the purposes of the regulation. So this may be an example of, let's say there's a large retailer in the province, and let's say company ABC is the manufacturer of that lighting product. They brand it, and then they get sold specifically in an Ontario retailer store, and that large retailer also brands that light bulb because it's a product that's only sold at this retailer. Because company ABC is most closely connected to the production and the manufacturing of that product, then company ABC, for the purposes of the regulation, is considered the obligated brand holder under the regulation. Again, if more than one item of electronics, and this is really, when we're thinking about multiple products packaged within like a bundle package, if more than one item of electronics is produced by different brand holders and marketed in a single package, then the producer who's most directly connected to the primary product in the package is the brand holder. I'm unsure at this time if this is common practice for obligated lighting material, but I'll give an example of what it means in the tire world, and then I'll think of an example of what it means in the ITTAV world. And so in the tires regulation, we have tire manufacturers and tire brand holders such as Goodyear and Michelin, big brands that sell nationwide. They distribute and market those tires directly to consumers in Ontario. So they're brand holders, but there are also other ways that tires come into the province, and those are on new vehicles, right? And so the person selling the car, so that could be an auto manufacturer, they are responsible for reporting those tires that come on those cars. That's sort of the same concept. Sorry, I have my dog there growling in the back. I'm just going to pause for one. So I hope that was clear. If not, I'm happy to answer that in our next question sort of section. So we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so there are some questions that we can ask ourselves as when we're trying to determine if your company is an obligated producer. And so some of the key questions that you can ask yourself is my company the brand holder for the products that we supply? If yes, does my company have residency in Canada? And if you answered yes to both of these questions, then you are the obligated producer, and you are required to report and register with our PRA. Sort of another sort of question to consider, does my company import any of the products we supply from outside of Ontario? And is there a resident brand holder for those products that we import? So if the brand holder is resident in Canada, they are the obligated producer, and potentially you as a wholesaler who is importing into the province of Ontario does not make you obligated because you are not the brand holder of that product. Again, we have to come back to the hierarchy that the person who is obligated always falls on the resident brand holder. So regardless of whether you're importing a specific brand that has residency in Canada, because the producer hierarchy falls under this sort of system, it's always the brand holder resident in Canada who the obligation falls onto, even if you're a wholesaler or a retailer of that brand holder's product into the province of Ontario. The second point here on the second sort of line here is that if the brand holder is not resident in Canada and you are resident in Ontario, then you are the obligated producer for the products that you import and supply into Ontario. So let's say you're importing from outside of Canada, overseas, and that brand holder doesn't have any residency here, and you're the one who is importing that material to be sold to Ontario consumers. That makes you the obligated producer under the second hierarchy, which is resident importer in Ontario. The third point here is that does my company market any product directly to consumers in Ontario? So excuse me, if you market products directly to a consumer in Ontario and there is no resident brand holder or importer, then you are the obligated producer for those products. And this is even true if your company does not have residency in Ontario, if there is no marketer resident in Ontario. So that's sort of like the online sales example that I gave earlier. Next slide, please. So there are some producer exemptions. And so what this means is that before any reductions that may be applicable to your supply data, if your supply data falls within not your supply data. So supply data calculates a management requirement. And if that management requirement is less than 350 kilograms, then that producer is exempt from the following things, which means that they do not have to register or report to Ripra. It means that they do not have to establish a collection or a management system for the lighting products that they sell into Ontario, and they don't have to engage in any of the promotion and education requirements. I will say this though, that it's important to note that the management percentage requirement increases starting in 2025, and we'll get into that a little bit when we talk about supply data and management requirements. So, but I think an important thing here to highlight is that although you may be exempt now, you may not be exempt in subsequent years. So producers will still have to continue to pay attention to what they're supplying into the Ontario and making sure that if you're relying on that exemption threshold, that the exemption continues to exist. And if you're not required to register, there is still a requirement for that company to retain records relating to what's supplied into Ontario. And if an inspector, if an RPRA inspector does come and request that information, that information should be available upon request. Again, if anybody on the line is uncertain about whether they meet any exemption criteria, it's one of those things that we won't discuss your specific supply data, your specific business structure on this line. So I would encourage you to reach out to our compliance and registry team so that you can have a conversation with one of our officers and explain to them your business structure and whether you may meet the exemption threshold based on that and your potential requirement under the regulation. Next slide, please. Oh, so this is here just is illustrating the point that I had said about the exemption thresholds. So what does 350 kilograms or more of management requirement mean in terms of supply data? So you'll see in this table that in 2023, so the first three lines from 2023 through to 2025, the management requirement is to recover 30% of what was supplied into Ontario. So doing some reverse some reverse math on that. If your management requirement is 350 kilograms or more, that translates out into 1,167 kilograms of actual supplied. So what that means is that if you supply less than 1,167 on average between 2018 and 2019, it means that your management requirement is going to be less than 350 kilograms. And then that means, again, that you will be exempt from the requirements to register, report, and meet performance requirements under the 2023 performance period and through to the 2025 performance period. And as I indicated a minute ago, you'll see that in 2026, the 30% management requirement increases to 40%, and then in 2027, it increases to 50%. So this is why it's important for you to be mindful that if you are exempt in 1 year, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will be exempt in subsequent years. And as I said, in 2026, the percentage increases to 40 and then to 50% in 2027. So you'll see that the exempt number actually declines. So then it means that if the average supply between 2021 and 2023 is less than 875, it's roughly 300 or so kilograms less than what was the exemption threshold in 2023 through to 2025. So it's important for obligated producers to keep that in mind, that it does change. And so if you may be exempt 1 year, it doesn't mean that's the case the following year. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Pam.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can just pause here for a moment because we do have a few questions and I don't want them to get lost between sections. So I'll just ask a few now if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay. So we have a question about when a product is sold with 2 light bulbs, if one is pre-installed on the product and one sold separately as a replacement part, are both obligated?
Can you repeat the question? So
yes. So when a product is sold with 2 light bulbs, one would be installed and one would be sold as a replacement.
Are they
both
still
obligated?
Yeah. So I guess the question here, if I'm interpreting it right, is if it was sold as part of the same package and they were sold together as new, even if it's, I guess the question where my confusion lies here is, what does it mean that it's going to be installed? Because obligated material, and I think we get into this a little bit further in the presentation where we talk about that sold, a consumer is any sort of, it has a very broad definition. So I can be a consumer as an individual. I can be a consumer if I, so the IC&I sector, so commercial, institutional, hospitals, those are also consumers. And so if it's just being sold as a product to then be used in those buildings, it would be obligated. And so I'm unsure if I'm actually answering this question specifically. So I think what may be useful is if this person does contact our compliance and registry team and then stipulates the full sort of example, because I don't think I've fully answered and I fully understood the question here.
Okay. The next question you just touched on a little bit, but I think it would be great to clarify what the definition of consumer is.
Yes. So I know I had this here. I think I'll just talk top level about it, but I think we do have, and maybe somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, I think we do have an FAQ on what a consumer is on our website. But essentially, it does include all obligated. A consumer, again, falls, it could be an end user like myself. It could be a business. So if you're selling lighting to I don't know how this example, but like an educational institution, like I said, a hospital, any commercial building, things like that, those are all obligated consumers because they are the ones that will be ultimately using that product in the province of Ontario, and it's being marketed to them.
Thanks, Pam. And then we have a question about producer exemptions. So someone's asking if there's a rule regarding number of employees. So if management requirement is below 350 kilograms, but the company has more than a certain number of employees, would they still be required to register and report to RPRA?
So that's a good question. And there is no employee exemption in the e-regulation. That is something that is part of the batteries regulation, but it is not part of the e-regulation. So it's simply the weight threshold that would exempt you from registering, reporting, and meeting any other sort of requirement under the regulation.
And then our final question for this section would be, will we be updating our conversion factors for weights of lighting?
Yeah, so we do get into how to calculate actual weight, or how to use what you need to report in terms of supply weight into us. And so I will say this though, at this time, we won't be updating our weight conversion factors, but we do have alternate methods on what people can use to determine their supply. And I'll get into the specifics later on, but it's always best practice, if possible, to use actual weights. But we do have a couple of other ways for producers to figure out what the weight may be for their obligated products.
Okay, sounds good. The remaining questions in the queue will be covered later in the presentation, so I'm going to hold off on asking them. So hopefully our slides cover them later.
Great, thank you. So we are going to talk about registration and supply reporting. So you'll see here on the slide that lighting producers are required to register and report to RPRA via our digital registry by November 30th. And then there are 2 points here that if they marketed lighting between January 1st of 2018 and November 30th of this year, then they must register by that November 30th deadline. And if the producer didn't sell lighting product into Ontario within that time period, then they must do so within 30 days of marketing that lighting material into Ontario. So that could be December of this year, maybe January. So 30 days within you started marketing obligated lighting into Ontario, you are required to register with us. And then here we're going to talk about all producers have to report all of the information as follows when they register with us. And that's the name and contact information of the business, as well as provide what we call an executive attestation form. And that needs to be signed by someone within the company that has the authority to bind the corporation. You'll see that you have to report the weight of lighting supplied into Ontario in the calendar years of 2018, 2019, and 2020. And we'll get into more details of how you do that in the next few slides. So there is the ability to reduce management requirements based on post-consumer recycled content. And so if your lighting product does contain post-consumer recycled content, you would have to identify that as part of the supply data information. And we'll get into specifics on what post-consumer recycled content is. And then if you've retained a pro by the time you register, which you may have, as we know some pros are already contacting potential producer clients, then you are required to identify the pro that you've retained. And it's possible that maybe you've retained multiple pros. and then you've contracted them for different services, again, which we'll talk more about pros later on in the presentation. But that is something that would be required as part of the registration and reporting period. And then you will have to pay an annual program fee to RPRA. And one thing here that I think is important for us to really communicate with everyone that's on the line is that the regulation doesn't allow producers to give the registration process or requirement to somebody else. So it is the producer who has to register and provide that information and say, hey, I am legally obligated to register and report this data. And they will do so by providing, the name and contact information of the account holder, signing this executive attestation form. It does have to be the producer company who does this. Next slide, please. So I'll get into a little bit about what are RPRA's annual program fees. And so program fees cover RPRA's costs related to building and operating the digital registry and any of the compliance and enforcement activities that we undertake. The program fees are the charges that obligated producers are required to pay RPRA in order to support our operations. The program fee is based on fees that RPRA recently approved in June of this year through our annual fee consultation process, and we do this annually. If you weren't necessarily involved in any of that, just note that we do sort of do that annually. And you'll see here that this year's fees for lighting producers. So there's a fee of 22 cents a kilogram for producers who supplied an average of more than 350 kilograms of lighting between 2018 through to 2020. If you supplied less than 350 kilograms on average between those 3 years, then there's a flat fee of $75. Once the supply data is reported into the digital registry, the producer will be able to see their program fee and associated management requirements. And just another thing to note about the digital registry is that there will be different methods of payment options available to you. I think it includes check, bank withdrawal, electronic bill payment, EDI, which I think may be referenced as an EFT. And then there's also the ability to pay by credit card. Instructions on how to submit payment will be sent by email once the report is submitted, except for the credit card, as that's taken in real time within the registry itself. And then please note that the invoices are payable on 30 days from issuance. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about what supplied into Ontario actually means. So now that we know that by November 30th, obligated producers have to report the weight of lighting supplied in Ontario for those 3 calendar years, 2018 through to 2020, what does supplied actually mean? So lighting is considered supplied when it's marketed into Ontario, meaning that it's been sold with, distributed, or leased or rented to someone in Ontario. So, so lighting that is imported is not necessarily supplied into Ontario until it's actually been marketed. And this is sort of the situation where somebody might deliver products to a distribution center that happens to be in Ontario, but then half of those products end up being sent to a different distribution center based in Manitoba, BC, or Quebec. So that's not required to be reported to our RPRA. Only the lighting that remains in Ontario and used by consumers in Ontario must be reported. And this is sort of touching base on what I had, one of the questions that came earlier in about consumers, that lighting is considered supplied into Ontario, and it's applicable to all sectors of the Ontario economy. So residential consumers, business consumers, hospital consumers, institutional and commercial consumers, and industrial consumers. They're all consumers of lighting. And the producers of those lighting products must report all of that data to RPRA. The last point here as well is that I think if it's leased to someone in Ontario, even if the product is taken back by the producer at the end of the life cycle, that initial lease, it needs to be recorded as supply, and therefore it's reported as supply data for the purposes of meeting the requirement in the regulation. Next slide, please. Supply data is used to determine a producer's performance obligation. You'll see here that the percentage of the weight that you supplied is your performance requirement. So as I touched on briefly a few minutes ago, in 2023, you will have to recover 30% of the weight of what you supplied to Ontario, making best efforts to do so, to do that in 2024 as well. And then you'll see that that percentage goes up in 2026 to 40%, and in 2027 to 50%. And you see, you'll start off this year in 2022 reporting your supply data for 2018 through to 2020. That sets your requirement for 2023. Then in 2023, you will add, so because it's an annual supply reporting cadence, in 2023, you'll come back and you'll provide your 2021 supply data. And then you'll see here that the 2018 calendar year will no longer be part of that calculation in the second line. Instead, it'll be it'll take into account the 2019 through to 2021 calendar year. In 2024, you will report your 2022 supply data and so forth. And again, you'll see that it's a rolling average of 3 years of supply data. So your management requirement will then determine if you're exempt from any obligations under the regulation. And this is sort of what I had mentioned earlier as well, that it is up to the producer to ensure that because these percentages are changing, that they are doing their due diligence to ensure that they are meeting the exemption criteria each year, because although you may be exempt in 1 year, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will be exempt in subsequent years. So if you don't meet this exemption, this formula is really determining the minimum weight of light that you're required to manage or recover through the process of collection and recycling in Ontario. And something that I think is really important to say here on the line is that this is not a quota, this is a minimum requirement. The collection system has to operate all year round, and everything that gets collected has to be processed and recycled. So if you had a performance requirement of, let's say, 100 tons, and you reached 100 tons of performance in September of next year, you can't stop. The option is, there's no option to stop. The collection system continues to operate, and everything that gets collected in that collection system has to be processed and then reported as part of a producer's performance. So again, really important to remember that these are minimum requirements. And the other thing that I will say, you'll see in the chart that there is a reference to best efforts. This is an enforceable standard. Essentially, you know, best efforts, you can't just sit back and do nothing. You have to make all reasonable efforts to make sure that producers or pros on your behalf can recover at least excuse me, at least 30% of what was supplied into Ontario. So when you're talking to your service providers, you'll want to exercise appropriate due diligence to ensure that you are contracting with them, with the understanding that you will ensure that they are going to meet those management requirements. And as I said, the requirement doesn't meet that once you hit the 30% mark, that's it. It has to be a continuous requirement throughout the course of the year. Next slide, please. So how do we determine our supply data? So this is going to be the main, it's going to be a slide that we're going to focus on how you can determine what lighting, what your supply weight is for 2018 through to 2020. So given the fact that you're required to report the total weight of the lighting that was marketed into Ontario, you have to start with knowing how many units you marketed into Ontario in those 3 calendar years. And then you have to know what the unit weight is in order to come up with that total weight. So let's start with determining the units. So you've got a couple of options as a producer on how you can determine the number of units that were sold into Ontario. So if you know the actual units of what you marketed into Ontario, based on your point of sale, based on the records retention that you have as a business process within your company, then you would obviously use the actual units of what was sold into Ontario. An alternative approach is set out in the regulation itself that allows you to use a formula to calculate the number of units that you might have supplied into Ontario. And you'll be able to see more specifics about it in the regulation, but also if you read our e-verification and audit registry procedure. But essentially, it's based on the ratio of the population of Ontario against the population of all the provinces and territories in Canada in which you supplied lighting. And these numbers are taken from Statistics Canada. So if you know your national sales in Canada, and then using that Statistics Canada population from Ontario, and the Statistics Canada information about population of the other provinces and territories that you actually sell into, you can use this formula to determine the number of units that you supplied into Ontario to get to the number of units that was actually sold in Ontario. And then the next thing to do from there is to convert those units into weights. And so a question had come up earlier about, potentially if Ripra was going to update the waste conversion tool that we have. So our first sort of a call out here is that the ideal scenario would be to use actual weights. It's our understanding that nowadays specs are maybe more readily available, and that some companies do understand that what the specs are for their products, and in that case, you would multiply the units sold by the actual weight that you have on record. The alternative is to use a calculated weight using the weight conversion factor. Again, those weight conversion factors are available in our registry procedure. They will also be available in our digital registry once producers use that system. But if you don't see a weight conversion factor as a reference, then you should use the actual weight. And a third option to help sort of producers figure out what the weight of the product could be is to go the route of subtracting a packaging factor from the total weight of a product and its packaging. So there is an obligation to provide accurate data here. So you can't just make up a packaging factor. It has to be based on something that's reasonable. So if producers are looking on using the packaging factor criteria, I would encourage them to contact the compliance and registry team to discuss the approach. It's important for RPRA to understand the rationale and the reasoning as to why a producer may not be able to use the actual weights or weights set out in the weight conversion tool, and that they're going to be providing an alternate approach. So we do encourage them to contact us so that we can understand that they may want to use this as an alternative. And with that being said, producers may also want to bring forward their own methodology for RPRA to review. So in that instance as well, I would encourage producers to contact our team and figure that out. Next slide, please. So one of the things that producers can do when reporting their supply weight is reduce the supply weight, which then, of course, reduces their management requirements. The way that they can do this is if the product contains post-consumer recycled glass or plastic, then the producer can reduce the supply weight by the weight of that post-consumer recycled glass or plastic in the product. So essentially, post-consumer recycled content is material that was recovered from the products or packaging that has been used by consumers. So for example, let's say if you're a producer of a light bulb and each light bulb that you supply into Ontario contains 0.02 kilograms of post-consumer recycled plastic or glass. And let's say that you supply 1,000 units of those light bulbs. It means that you can reduce the supply weight by 20 kilograms. So it's sort of a one-to-one reduction. But something to really important to highlight is that there is a threshold in the sense that the producers can only reduce their management requirement up to a cumulative amount of 50%. So we can't go more than that. Even if you apply for it, there is, we cannot reduce the management requirement for that particular year more than 50%. This the PCR, the post-consumer recycled content, does have to be verified in accordance with our e-verification and audit and registry procedure. So producers do not have to verify that they're don't have to verify the post-consumer recycled content until 2024. But again, as I mentioned earlier before, that it's important that this doesn't reduce the producer's obligation to report accurate data. And again, it doesn't limit the ability of a compliance officer to review the data and related records associated with what's being reported in order to ensure compliance on the producer side. So again, it doesn't have to be verified by a third-party auditor, but at the same time, the data has to be accurate as best to your knowledge. And if an inspector from Ripra does come and asks for supporting documentation because, you know, they want to inspect it a little bit further, they do have the ability, and it would be up to the producer to provide that data to the inspector on request. Next slide, please. So I think this is probably another time where we would like to pause for questions.
Yes. Thanks, Pam. So before I ask some questions, I just wanted to clarify, because we saw some questions coming in about exemptions. So if you are a producer that is under the exemption threshold, you do not need to register and report, and therefore you do not pay a program fee. So I just wanted to make that clear so there's no confusion there. We do have a question regarding definitions, so I am just going to ask it since a few people have upvoted, Pam. So is integrated lighting included as part of the lighting definition? Integrated lighting means a lighting fixture that is inclusive of a light bulb, which is supplied or sold as a single item.
So my understanding is that the fixture itself that includes the lighting does not have to be reported, but the replacement or the lighting that is sold separately from that fixture would be considered obligated and must be reported as supply data to our PRA.
Question about resellers. So does supplied also apply when selling to another reseller in Ontario?
So if I understand this correctly, this would be an instance where, let's say, a distributor. So again, this would really depend on who the actual obligated producer is in this instance. So as an example, I'll use the brand holder. So brand holder resident in Canada, if they are selling it to a distributor, that distributor receives that brand of lighting in Ontario, but then that distributor has other relationships, and then they're essentially selling that to a small retailer, and that retailer is selling it into Ontario. The producer hierarchy still says that the brand holder resident in Canada is still the obligated party. So the brand holder producer may have line of sight to everything that gets passed down through the supply chain. They may not. And so, but still ultimately it would be the brand holder resident in Canada who has to report that, even if it was resold to somebody, if it was being distributed in a different manner into Ontario. And this is why we have some of those national sales, Ontario sales, to be able to, for the producers to be able to determine their units, because again, if things are getting passed down in the supply chain and they don't have that visibility, they do have the alternate way of figuring out the units that were sold into the province based on that formula that's outlined in the reg and also in our e-procedure for verification.
Thanks, Pam. We have a question here that I think is important to ask out loud. And someone's just wondering if we can please provide the method we use to establish the weight conversion tool, if that's available.
The weight conversion tool that is added in our registry procedure.
That's what I'm assuming they're referring to.
And they want to share, would like to know the methodology.
Yeah, or if we can just provide an explanation of our weight conversion factors.
So I will be honest, and I will have to say that I was not in part of that project itself. So I don't have the answer. I'm not equipped with the knowledge right now to be able to sort of elaborate on that. So but if it's a question that is coming up, we will take that back. And if it's something that we need to update our FAQs or sort of, get back to these individuals in particular, I think we can commit to following up. But I can't elaborate on that right now because it was out of scope for my knowledge when that was being developed. So I'm sorry that I can't answer that on the line for everyone.
Okay, thanks, Pam. We have a question about, I think, very good question. Just wondering if someone is below the management threshold, how our PRA would know that they're below the threshold, if they are or are not, if they're not registering with us. So basically how, I think this goes to free riders and how we would be able to tell if someone's not even registering or submitting even a year of supply data to us, how we would be able to tell.
Yes, so this is a very loaded question in the sense that so there are two sort of things that we keep in mind in terms of so we are in our I had discussed earlier that we do sort of this communication for compliance, and we try to educate and inform potentially obligated parties on what their requirements may be. So we are going to be reaching out to potential producers and engage in those conversations. And so that's sort of one sort of approach in how we're going to try to determine if potential producers meet these exemptions. Secondly, is that in any case in the future, we do have those inspection powers. And so you would have heard me say that even though you're self-assessing and saying, I don't supply enough into Ontario, therefore I am exempt. If an inspector does come knocking on your door and saying, you know, I've noticed that you didn't register, you know, can you show me some of those records where, you know, you're essentially validating and confirming that you are below this exemption? Those records must be given to an inspector on request, because we have those inspection powers. And then sort of the third sort of approach to this is that we do have, I won't get into the specifics about our compliance plans for free riders, but we do take it on a, RPRA takes a risk-based approach to compliance. And this approach focuses on the potential risks that arise from non-compliance, and then assessing those risks to guide the use of our compliance tools and deployment of the resources that we have internally to minimize risk and maximize compliance. And so it's also really important to know that competitors competitors will be talking. And so if somebody sees that somebody isn't registered and they want to ensure there's a level playing field, you know, people may come to us and say, hey, I noticed my competitor isn't a registered producer, because we will be posting all of our registered producers. The same thing we do for all of our other programs that we oversee. We list the list of registered producers, service providers, and pros. So that list will be made public. If a competitor comes and says, hey, I've noticed that XY company isn't registered, you know, I'm unsure if, you know, they need to, but, you know, if, you know, because Ripra, one of our mandates is to ensure a level playing field, we do take potential free riders seriously. And although we can't discuss the specifics of the information that does come to us that may be flagged by someone who thinks that their competitor is free riding in the system, we can't discuss the specifics, but we will do our due diligence to review and get back to the identified party to ensure that, you know, they are providing RPRA accurate information, and if they're not, that they're understanding what that actually means, because all of this is enforceable as part of the criteria that must be met under the regulations. So that was a very long-winded answer. I hope that was okay for the person who asked it.
Yeah, very detailed. Thanks, Pam. We have one more question, and I can answer this. It's just to clarify. So if you are a producer, before November 30th, you are to report your supply data for 2018, 2019, and 2020, and the average of those 3 years will determine your management requirement for 2023. So the answer to that is yes, you're correct. And then we have one more question that just came in, Pam, and it's just asking what year supply data will be subject to verification.
I think that data needs to be verified in 2024, and I think the year that needs to be verified, so it's based on the data that's reported in 2024, which will include 2022, 2021 and 2020 supply data. And so that's what needs to be verified when you report your supply data in 2024.
Thank you. I think we're ready to move forward.
I think I may have misspoken, and so it does need to be verified in 2024, but it's possible that you only need to verify your 2022 data. I think the specific dates are actually outlined in the audit and verification procedure. So I may have misspoke in the sense that it has to be those 3 calendar years, and it may only be 2022 that needs to be verified. Okay, so if we just want to move forward to the collection and management requirements. Yes, thank you. So what needs to happen by January 1st of next year? And essentially, you've already heard me talk about the requirement to collect and operate a collection network, and then managing what's collected within that network. And so essentially, this is what we're going to get to in the next few slides, that by January 1st of next year, producers are required to establish this collection system for lighting. As it relates to the second bullet point, there are different management requirements set out in the regulation for small and large producers. So a small producer, as it relates to meeting management requirements, is defined as someone who must manage more than 350 kilograms, but less than 35 tons of lighting in a performance period. So you'll see that exempt producers who supply 350 or less, producers whose management requirement is 350 kilograms or less are exempt from collection and management requirements. And so it makes sense here that a small producer meets the definition of having to manage more than 350 kilograms, but less than 35 tons of lighting during a performance period. And then subsequently, a large producer is defined as someone who must manage more than 35 tons of lighting in a performance period. So we won't get into all of the details on collection systems. More information is available on our website. But I will highlight this, that large producers must ensure that that there are at least a certain amount of collection sites within municipalities and territorial districts, so that consumers can drop off their end of life lighting products. A small producer can meet that requirement. They have two options. They have the option of meeting their requirement the same way as a large producer, in terms of having collection sites based on population thresholds between municipalities and territorial districts, or they can also have the option of providing collection sites as it relates to their retail locations. And I believe that they have to have at least 75% in terms of numbers of collection sites within a municipality, based on how many retail locations they have within that municipality as well. So let's say you're a big retailer, you have 4 retail locations within the city of Toronto. You have to at least ensure that 75% of those 4, which is 3, that those 3 collection sites are accepting used and end of life lighting material. So essentially, setting up and establishing a collection system is fundamental to be in place, mainly because it's ensuring that consumers can drop off lighting free of charge at each site, and then it does need to satisfy certain criteria. But again, all of that stuff is available on our website. But essentially, it's saying if you're a retail collection site, that you must accept at least similar products into what you sold, that you have to accept end-of-life lighting between normal business hours, and there's a certain threshold of how much kilogram amount you have to accept in a day, and all of that information can be found in the link that's referenced here in this slide. And one thing as well to sort of note is that producers can reduce their accessibility requirements, which again means ensuring that there are enough collection sites within the province for consumers to dispose of those end-of-life products. And in order to reduce some of those accessibility requirements, producers can offer options such as curbside collection, mail-back programs, or even hosting collection events. And again, all of that information can be viewed on our website. Next slide, please. Okay, so as of Jan 1st of next year, producers must also ensure that they establish and operate a system for managing used lighting. So all of that material that is being collected as part of the collection system must be processed within 3 months of being collected. And just to be clear, managed means reused, refurbished, or processed, and is now essentially a recovered resource. So for the first performance period, it is the full 2023 calendar year. It is based again on that formula that you've seen in subsequent slides about the average supply of what was marketed into Ontario between 2018 and 2018 through to 2020, and then that 30% percentage that as a multiplication factor, which is the best effort sort of threshold. And then it calculates an output in tonnage that a producer must meet. And so in 2023 calendar year, the lighting must be collected and managed, and then that total performance gets reported to RPRA in the following year, so in April of 2024. So this last bullet point talks about the recycling efficiency rate, or RER, and RER applies specifically to processors. It means the ratio of the weight of resources recovered from lighting received by a lighting processor. So it's that ratio to the weight of lighting received, of the total lighting that was received by the lighting processor. And what we're really getting at here is that in 2025, producers can only use a lighting processor that is registered with RPRA and has an RER of 50% for lighting and 90% for mercury from lighting. And so additional details of all of this can be found in our registry procedure for the verification and audit procedure, as well as our processing and refurbishing procedure that talks about some of these standards. But I do want to highlight that the important thing or the immediate focus is for producers to ensure that by January 1st, they have this operational collection and management system starting on January 1st to ensure that lighting is getting collected and processed. That really is the immediate focus for, in addition to obviously determining your supply data, once that's fulfilled and you do determine that you have management requirements to fulfill, that the next focus there is to ensure that the system is up and running by January 1st. Next slide, please. So there are some promotional and educational requirements, again, recognizing that that individual producers have an individual performance management requirement, and that they are obligated to operate a collection system, which is going to drive their ability to achieve that performance. So here it's obviously in the interest of producers or their pros on behalf of those producers to ensure that people understand that there are collection sites within the province, that there are collection events being hosted, that if a producer does offer a curbside collection program or any sort of mail back program, that producers know that this is available to them. So, and this serves the producer as well, because if people know where to drop off end of life material, it ensures that that system is kept operational, because then material is being collected and then it's being managed and processed. And essentially it keeps the system going. So if producers don't know where to drop off the end of life material, then producers and the service providers can't get that material and do the subsequent work, right? And so you'll see here that the promotion and education requirement is shown here, that you're required to make some effort to raise public awareness between January 1st of next year to December 31st of 2024. So the regulation is setting out a minimum requirement for the first 2 years. And the fact that there's no specified requirement in future years doesn't mean that you won't need to consider doing it continuously. So when you're getting into a commercial agreement with a pro or a service provider, you want to make sure that the collection system, in fact, can generate what it needs to generate in order to meet your individual producer requirements. So it's very important to consider all of these factors as part of that commercial relationship that you're going to get into with a pro or a service provider. Ultimately, the failure to meet these performance obligations in terms of promotion and education, establishing a collection and management network, it is a producer's obligation, and it can become a problem, a compliance issue, if the individual producer doesn't meet those requirements that are stipulated in the regulation. Next slide, please. Okay, so we covered the obligations of producers needing to establish a collection and management network. And here you'll just see that this needs to be reported again in April of next year. And so what needs to be reported here is, because you know where your collection sites are going to be, there is a requirement, again, to report within the registry, the digital registry, the location of every collection site that is part of your system, a description of those collection services. So if you're offering curbside, mail back program, collection events, you'll need to identify a description of those services that you're offering. And then you'll also need to identify the haulers, processors, and refurbishers that are making part, that are essentially the key players and keeping this collection and management system going. So this is our touch base point to make sure that the collection and management systems are up and running the way that they should be. Hopefully all of them will be well underway by the January 1st, 2023 date. And just keep in mind that this needs to be reported to us in April of next year. And then, and this, again, this is going to ensure that the system is operating as expected and that material essentially is moving within the province. Next slide, please. So wanted to sort of touch base here on visible fees and what that actually means under the regulation. So under the e-regulation, there are no requirements related to visible fees, environmental fees, eco fees, or any other sort of fee related terminology that can be used in various contexts. The thing here for producers to understand is that resource recovery fees are not mandatory. So if a retailer is recovering separate fees, from a consumer, it's really important that the retailer understands as well that a consumer will want to know what that fee is going towards. The explanation can't be that it's a mandatory requirement that the consumer has to pay, because that's not true. Resource recovery fees is just a way of separating out some of the costs of the product that the producer is responsible for. Again, the producers are responsible for the entire life cycle of those products that they sell into Ontario. And during that course of the development of that life cycle, once it reaches its end of life, it does incur costs like collecting, recycling, and disposal, right? So it is up to the producer to determine if they want to choose to charge this visible resource recovery fee on their products when it's supplied into Ontario. And then it's also up to the retailers to decide if they want to pass that visible fee onto the consumer themselves. It's up to the retailers, again, to decide if they want to do that, or if they want to potentially embed it into the price of their product. So again, the only reason why we're highlighting this is, we've seen from other programs that we've transitioned into our RCEA world that there are separate line items for fees, and sometimes consumers do get confused as to who is charging that fee, why is that fee being charged, and ultimately what it's going to. So, if a producer or a retailer chooses to pass down those fees, it's really important to be very detailed as to the person who is responsible for imposing the charge. And again, because it's a resource recovery fee, how that charge is being used to collect, reduce, reuse, and recycle and recover lighting. It's really important that it cannot be stipulated as being a tax, because that's not what it is. And it definitely also is not a RPRA fee, so it cannot be labeled as such. Next slide, please. Okay.
So we don't have any questions right now, Pam, and just for the sake of time, I think we can move forward. And if we have questions, we do have another slide at the very end for that. So I'd say let's move forward.
Okay, great, thank you. So this is where it all comes together in terms of how producers can what the producer requirements are, and sort of what can producers do next. So you heard me talk a lot about producer responsibility organizations, what they are, and so essentially producer responsibility organizations, I'm just going to refer to it as pros because it's a lot easier. These are private companies that can be for profit, not for profit, but essentially they are companies that are seeing a business opportunity right now in Ontario. These are companies who come out and say, hey, I can help a producer do all of these things that I just spoke about in the previous sections about establishing collection and management systems. So pros are coming and saying, I can help producers establish and operate collection and management systems on their behalf. I can help ensure that they have a promotion and education piece in place to inform consumers that they can dispose of end-of-life products at these locations. And I can help them in terms of their performance reporting requirements. So, they'll work with the service providers, the haulers, the processors, refurbishers in the industry to ensure that material is being collected, transported, and recycled accordingly. And then, on the other side, when the performance reports have to be submitted to our PRA, and there's the auditing requirement as well in subsequent years, the pro is coming and saying, I can do that for my producer clients. And I can get all of that sorted for them. So we do have examples in other regulations where producers are doing this on their own behalf. So as part of their line of business, they may have relationships with refurbishers or processors that they send products to. But it does exist in other programs. But if a producer doesn't have the ability to do this on their own, they have the ability to hire a pro. Again, it's using the word hire because it is a commercial arrangement that the pro is going to be contracting with you for. Very important for us to highlight that our PRA is not reviewing the pro's finances. We are not confirming that they have a viable plan to do this on your behalf. Our PRA is not saying that they will actually achieve compliance for you. So as a producer, you really need to determine, just like you would with any vendor that you enter into a contract with, that you ensure that they're actually going to deliver on what they say they're going to deliver for you. So if that's regularly having touch points, or if that's, I don't know what an individual producer's due diligence would be to ensure that the pro or any service provider is doing things for you in a timely manner on your behalf. It's really just a call out for us to say that it's a commercial arrangement that the producer has with the pro or service provider, and Ripra has no visibility to the contractual agreements that you guys have in place. So it's really important for those producers to take ownership of that. And so again, as I mentioned, pros can arrange for a collection and management system. So arranging, establishing, and operating that system. They can help on the promotion and education portion. And again, they can prepare and submit reports on your performance on your behalf. Next slide, please. So here again, it talks about the options of producers of what they have now in the new IPR framework, where they can hire a pro to do this on their behalf. Producers have the option of directly contracting with the service providers themselves. And I think I had mentioned as well in the other slide that it is important that the producers, when they enter into these agreements, they are doing their due diligence to ensure that the contract is stipulating certain things. And at the end of the day, it is always the producer's legal responsibility to ensure those requirements are being met, even if you are contracting with service providers and pros to help you with that. We can move to the next slide. And so this is sort of some things that you may want to, some questions that you may want to ask yourself about whether you need a pro or other service provider. So it really starts with figuring out what your requirements are under the reg. How much lighting does my company need to collect and manage? What's my management requirement based on what I supplied into Ontario? All things that we've gone through in previous slides, determining whether you're a small producer or a large producer for the purposes of establishing that collection system. So again, that means, a small producer can establish and operate a collection system meeting the same requirements as a large producer, or if they have retail locations, they can fulfill it that way. And some of these other questions that you may want to ask yourself about: can my company meet my own obligations without the service of a pro? And what sort of action can my company take to collect and recycle lighting in Ontario? So again, as it relates to all of the collection and management systems that need to be in place, it really is, again, for the requirement to let consumers know where they can drop off used lighting. So the next slide is really just following through on the last sort of point about, if you've asked those questions in the previous slide, and then, you're trying to determine if you if you do need to contract with a pro, like which obligations are my company unable to meet without the services of a pro? It's possible that a producer can establish a collection system, but also that collection system may not meet all of the requirements based on whether they meet the small or large producer. And so maybe they will contract with a pro to do partial establishment or management of an operating system on their behalf. So there are options. And so again, one thing I would consider is to figure out what your management requirements are, have discussions internally within your company to figure out if you have the processes in place to be able to do this on your own. If you do not, there are options out there for you. And we have in, I think, a couple of more slides, the pros that are currently registered with our PRA. And both of these pros are part of other, they offer services to producers under some of the other regulations that we oversee. So if you just want to skip over to the slide where we are showing all of the pros. Yes, so here you'll see the information of the pros that are currently offering services to obligated lighting producers. You have their contact information there. Again, it's always available on our website. And in the future, if more lighting pros register with us, everything will be posted on our website so that you can have a fulsome list of who you may want to reach out to should you determine that you would like to engage in the services of using a pro. So I know I've talked a lot. I think the last slide, we're coming up to the last of the presentation. So I will pause here just in case anybody has, oh no, so we'll continue. So I think just some key dates for us on the line to consider is that, there is a registration deadline for November 30th of this year. And you're required to submit the supply weight, the total supply weight for the 2018, 2019, and 2020 calendar years. I will say this, it is reported by year. So there will be specific sections for you to enter weights for each calendar year. And then again, in January of next year, this is where the collection and management requirements kick in, where collection sites need to be operational and lighting needs to be collected and managed from those collection sites within 3 months of being sorry, I lost my train of thought. It needs to be managed and processed within 3 months of being collected. And then again, you have that promotion and education requirement that again is indicating and letting consumers know that they have options of where they can drop off their end of life lighting products. So I will hand it over to Michelle. I think this is probably one of our last slides.
Yeah, thank you, Pam. So before we move forward to the resources slide, we will be launching a quick poll to gather your feedback on today's webinar. This just gives us a good understanding of how helpful this webinar was, as well as highlight ways we can enhance our approach to future webinars. So we will launch the poll now, and we appreciate your participation. Okay, we'll give it about 10 more seconds and we'll move forward. Okay, thank you, everyone. Next slide, please. So we can probably, let's skip to the following slide. Actually, it's more helpful. Okay, so we have many resources to support you. So we have our website, which is probably our best resource, besides calling our compliance and registry team who can speak to you directly. But we do have the e-regulation, we do have a web page for it, which highlights lighting. And then we have individual lighting web pages as well. So in this, on the slide, you can see the producer web page is linked, but we also have web pages for pros and other service providers as well. This webinar will be made available on our website later this afternoon, hopefully. And then also, as we've said throughout this presentation, our compliance and registry team is always here to support you. So for anyone who had specific questions today that maybe weren't answered out loud, please feel free to reach out to our compliance team. You can reach them at registry@rpra.ca, or you can call them as well. So I believe we have 8 minutes left, so we do have some time for additional questions. I will say there was one that was asked about when the registry will be open, and the answer is it will open early this fall. Everyone will be communicated or will receive a communication from RPRA about the registry, but for anyone who would like to make sure they are on our lists, again, please contact us and let us know so we can make sure that you will receive our communications moving forward. But if anyone has any questions about the last few slides about pros, please feel free to ask them now. If you have questions that maybe we were holding on to before in the presentation, this is a good time to ask them now as well. So we have a question about, again, about being an exempt producer based on the thresholds. And yes, if you're under the 350 kilogram threshold, that means you do not need to register, you do not need to report, you do not need a pro, and therefore you do not charge eco fees. As of that year, that, like Pam mentioned before, that can change on whether or not you are exempted for the following year.
Yeah, and I think it's important as well for us, like I had mentioned earlier, you know, if you're being passed down a fee from, so let's say in an instance, an eco fee or remitting an eco fee, that's sort of maybe old world sort of language. In the new sort of RRCA framework, we call them visible resource recovery fees, and resource recovery fees should only be, you know, potentially passed down from an obligated producer who actually has to fulfill these management requirements, which means collecting and ensuring that the laying products are being managed and processed. And so if you don't have that requirement, there's no fee to pass down to a consumer because there's no obligation for that producer to do that. So just something for us to keep in mind that, again, when somebody is passing down fees, it has to be we have to be very specific as to what that fee is going towards, because the consumer needs to know what they're paying that additional separate line item for. The other option, again, is to understand that collecting and recycling end-of-life materials is part of the whole IPR framework. And if producers want to embed that additional cost into the overall cost of their products, they can do that as well. It doesn't have to be separated. again, it's a decision that each company needs to make, but it needs to be very clear to the consumer if it is a separate line item, what they're being charged for and what it's going towards.
Thanks, Pam. We'll just wait another minute or two to see if there's any more questions. Okay, well, I see the number of people, some people are leaving. So on that note, again, if you have a question, please email us at registry@rpra.ca. And thank you very much for joining us today. We hope that this was helpful for you.
Thank you.